In the frigid expanse of the Southern Ocean, the General Grant sailed toward fortune, unaware that hidden reefs and jagged cliffs awaited in the shadows of the Auckland Islands. In 1866, the ship vanished, leaving its crew stranded on a desolate, unforgiving island where storms, hunger and isolation became daily threats, and hope was a fragile memory. Amid windswept cliffs and hidden coves, the survivors fought to endure, salvaging what they could from the wreck and facing months of relentless exposure. This story traces their harrowing struggle, desperate escapes, and the lingering mysteries of a gold-laden ship lost beneath the waves. The island ships were meant to avoid. Far out in the Southern Ocean, more than 400 kilometres south of New Zealand's South Island, a scattered chain of land rises abruptly from cold, restless water. The Auckland Islands appear on maps as little more than jagged outlines surrounded by empty ocean, yet for centuries sailors spoke of them with unease. Dense fog often drifted across the coastline without warning, and powerful subantarctic winds pushed vessels toward cliffs that seemed to emerge from the sea itself. By the 19th century, the islands had become a quiet warning in maritime navigation, a place where captains were careful to give a wide berth whenever possible. The archipelago was first recorded by Europeans in August 1806, when the British sealing ship Ocean sighted the rugged coastline while searching for new hunting grounds. Captain Abraham Bristow named the islands after William Eden, the first Baron Auckland, who at the time served as a prominent figure in the British Admiralty. Early visitors quickly learned that the islands were unlike the more temperate lands farther north. Towering basalt cliffs guarded many parts of the shoreline, rising directly from the sea in steep, dark walls that offered few safe landing places. Heavy rain and mist covered the hills for much of the year, and violent squalls could sweep across the water with little warning. Despite the harsh environment, the islands briefly attracted waves of sealers during the early 19th century, drawn by the enormous populations of fur seals that once crowded the rocky beaches. Temporary camps appeared along sheltered coves as crews hunted and processed the animals for valuable pelts. Yet the sealing industry declined quickly after the animals were hunted, almost to extinction, and by the 1820s, most of the rough settlements had been abandoned. Those who'd worked there left behind stories of relentless weather and isolation that few people could truly imagine without seeing it themselves. The location of the Auckland Islands made them particularly dangerous for ships travelling through the Southern Oceans. During the age of sail, vessels moving between Australia and Europe often followed routes that passed through these latitudes, where powerful westerly winds known as the Roaring Forties and Furious Fifties could speed ships across long distances. These winds allowed captains to shorten their journeys, but they also pushed vessels into regions where navigation demanded constant attention. A small miscalculation of position could carry a ship far off its intended course before anyone realised the error. 19th century navigation relied heavily on celestial observations and careful dead reckoning. Even experienced officers sometimes struggled to determine their exact position when thick clouds hid the sun or stars for days at a time. Ocean currents added another layer of uncertainty, quietly shifting vessels miles away from where their charts suggested they should be. In waters near the Auckland Islands, those currents flowed in complex patterns that could drag ships toward the rugged coastline before a lookout spotted land. The islands themselves formed a deceptive outline when approached from the sea. From a distance, they often appeared as dark shapes rising through mist, their high ridges partly hidden by low clouds that blurred the true height of the cliffs. Waves crashed constantly against the rock faces, sending spray high into the air, while narrow inlets and sea caves carved deep openings into the coastal walls. For a vessel caught too close, the landscape offered little mercy. There were few gradual shores and almost no beaches where a ship might run aground safely. Storms added to the danger. Weather systems that formed across the Southern Ocean often gathered strength before reaching the islands, driving heavy swells and gale-force winds toward the coastline. Sailors who survived such storms sometimes reported waves towering above the deck and winds strong enough to tear canvas from the rigging. In darkness or fog, the sound of surf crashing against unseen cliffs could reach a ship long before the land itself became visible. By the middle of the 19th century, the Auckland Islands had already witnessed several maritime tragedies. Ships occasionally disappeared after passing through these waters, leaving little trace of their fate. In 1864, the schooner Grafton wrecked on the island's rugged coast, forcing its crew to survive in isolation for months before they managed to escape. 2 years later, another vessel, the Invercargill, would meet a similar fate on the same remote shores, though its survivors endured even harsher conditions before rescue arrived. These events gradually cemented the island's reputation among seafarers as one of the most unforgiving places in the southern seas. Charts marked the archipelago clearly, but knowing its position did not always guarantee safety. Ships driven by strong winds sometimes struggled to alter course quickly enough to avoid the cliffs, especially if the weather changed suddenly. The sea itself seemed determined to guide vessels toward the rocks, as if the currents and winds formed a silent trap around the islands. Mariners who crossed these waters often kept anxious watch during the night hours, aware that one mistake in navigation could place them dangerously close to land. Most captains understood the risk and steered well clear whenever possible, preferring to lose time rather than gamble with the hidden dangers that surrounded the Auckland Islands. The wise decision was to keep a distance from the jagged coastline and continue across the wide emptiness of the Southern Ocean, where even harsh weather seemed safer than the cliffs waiting beneath the fog. But in May of 1866, a ship sailing home from Australia would drift far closer to those cliffs than its crew ever intended. A vessel built for the global gold trade. Thousands of kilometres from the storm-battered cliffs of the Auckland Islands, a different scene unfolded in a quiet American shipyard where a new ocean vessel was beginning to take shape. While the islands waited in cold isolation far to the south of New Zealand, the ship that would one day drift into their waters was being assembled in a place defined not by danger, but by industry and maritime tradition. Along the northeastern coast of the United States, the state of Maine had become one of the most productive shipbuilding regions of the 19th century. Its rivers and harbours lined with yards where wooden vessels were constructed for trade routes that stretched across the globe. Along the tidal banks of the Machias River in the eastern Maine, shipbuilders during the 1860s worked in a community deeply tied to the sea. The surrounding forests provided abundant timber, and generations of craftsmen had developed the knowledge required to turn those trees into vessels capable of crossing the world's oceans. Shipyards in towns such as East Machias and nearby ports launched dozens of sailing ships during this period, many of them destined for the expanding global trade networks that connected North America, Europe, and the colonies of the Southern Hemisphere. These vessels were not built for short coastal journeys, but for months-long voyages across open water where endurance mattered as much as speed. In 1864, one of those shipyards completed a large three-masted sailing vessel that would soon carry the name General Grant. Like many ships built in Maine during that era, it was constructed primarily from strong wooden timbers carefully shaped and fastened together to create a hull capable of withstanding heavy seas. The ship was designed for long-distance merchant service, a role that demanded reliability above all else. Ocean voyages during the 19th century could last for months, and vessels operating along international trade routes needed to survive storms, shifting winds, and long stretches of open ocean far from any safe harbour. Built from heavy timbers and rising high above the waterline, the General Grant measured just over 1,000 tons burthen, placing it among the larger merchant sailing ships of its time. 3 tall masts supported a complex arrangement of sails that allowed the vessel to capture wind from multiple directions, a crucial feature for ships navigating the unpredictable conditions of the world's oceans. Beneath the deck lay cargo holds capable of storing substantial freight, while accommodations were arranged to house both crew members and passengers who often travelled on these long intercontinental routes. The ship was not unusual in appearance compared with other merchant vessels of the era, yet it represented the culmination of decades of maritime experience in designing ships capable of surviving distant voyages. Merchant ships of this class were created for endurance rather than speed. Their wide hulls provided stability in rough seas, while their sail plans allowed crews to adjust quickly to shifting winds. Life aboard such vessels required constant labour from sailors who trimmed sails, maintained rigging, and monitored the condition of the ship as it crossed vast distances of open water. The men who worked these ships were accustomed to difficult conditions, knowing that storms, mechanical failures, or navigational errors could transform an ordinary voyage into a dangerous ordeal. During the mid-19th century, vessels like the General Grant formed part of a maritime network that stretched across nearly every ocean on the planet. Trade routes connected ports in Europe and North America with distant destinations in Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. Ships carried manufactured goods outward from industrial nations and returned with raw materials, agricultural products, and valuable cargo gathered from distant colonies and settlements. These voyages were long and uncertain, yet they became the foundation of a rapidly expanding global economy that depended on maritime transport. Few developments reshaped those trade routes more dramatically than the discovery of gold in Australia during the early 1850s. News of rich deposits in regions such as Victoria triggered a massive migration as prospectors travelled from around the world, hoping to find their fortune. Ports like Melbourne quickly grew into bustling centres of commerce, where ships arrived carrying migrants, supplies and equipment for the expanding mining settlements scattered across the Australian landscape. Within a few years, the goldfields had transformed the colony's economy and created an enormous flow of wealth that moved across the oceans. For the maritime industry, the gold rush created new opportunities and new demands. Ships travelling between Australia and Britain carried passengers who had spent years searching for gold, along with cargo ranging from woolen hides to refined metal destined for markets in Europe. Many of the passengers who boarded these ships were miners, returning home after long periods in remote mining camps. Some carried only modest savings, while others transported significant quantities of gold they had earned through years of difficult labour. Within this constant movement of travellers and cargo, vessels such as the General Grant found steady employment along the routes linking Australian ports with distant markets. The journey between Australia and Britain was one of the longest regular sea voyages of the era, stretching across the Indian Ocean and around the southern reaches of Africa before reaching the Atlantic. Ships making the passage required experienced crews and capable captains who understood the winds and currents that govern travel through these vast waters. Command of the General Grant eventually rested with Captain William H. Laughlin, a mariner entrusted with navigating the vessel across these demanding routes. Like many captains of merchant ships during the 19th century, his responsibilities extended far beyond steering the vessel. He oversaw the safety of passengers, the management of cargo, and the navigation of waters that could change from calm to dangerous with little warning. Every decision carried consequences, particularly on voyages where the nearest land might lie hundreds or even thousands of kilometres away. By the mid-1860s, the ship was operating within this global system of trade and migration, moving between distant ports where passengers and cargo waited to be carried across the world's oceans. Each voyage followed a path shaped by wind patterns and established maritime routes. Yet the success of those journeys depended heavily on weather, navigation, and the constant vigilance of those aboard. For the General Grant, another such voyage was approaching, one that would begin in the busy colonial port of Melbourne before setting out across the wide and unpredictable waters of the southern seas. In the bustling harbour of Melbourne, passengers carrying the hard-earned wealth of the goldfields were already preparing to step aboard. The passengers carrying fortune across the ocean. Activity filled the docks of Melbourne as passengers, cargo handlers and sailors moved steadily around the vessel, preparing for another long voyage across the world's oceans. The port thrived with the constant rhythm of ships arriving and departing, each carrying passengers and goods that connected the distant Australian colonies to Europe and beyond. Amid the clatter of ropes and the smell of tarred wood, the General Grant loomed over the wharf, its tall masts swaying lightly in the harbour breeze, waiting to carry its human cargo into the vast and unpredictable Southern Ocean. By the mid-1860s, Melbourne had grown into one of the busiest ports in the Southern Hemisphere, its streets crowded with merchants, migrants and labourers drawn by the promise of wealth from the goldfields of Victoria. The city's economy pulsed with the energy of people moving across continents, and its harbour was filled with vessels of every size, each marked with the purpose of trade or the movement of passengers eager to return home or seek new opportunities. The port itself seemed to hum with the weight of ambition and the hope of fortune, a temporary staging ground for journeys that might last months. Across the colony, thousands of men who had once arrived in Australia chasing gold were now preparing to leave, their years in the mining camps drawing to a close. Many had spent long seasons in isolated settlements, living in tents or rough huts, and enduring conditions shaped by both the harsh land and the fickle success of mining. Others had laboured in commercial operations, extracting ore or transporting it to towns and ports along the coast. Each passenger carried with them the remnants of a life defined by risk, work, and the tantalizing lure of wealth, their experiences shaping a collective anticipation as they readied themselves for the next stage of their journey. Among those gathering at the waterfront were travellers of many kinds, including miners returning home, emigrants seeking new opportunities, and individuals simply attempting to cross the immense distance between continents. Families and friends said quiet farewells along the dockside, while others kept their thoughts to themselves, aware that months at sea would test endurance and patience alike. The mixture of hope, relief, and apprehension was palpable, a human tide that mirrored the movement of cargo and rigging around the ship. Every passenger, in some measure, carried a fragment of the colony's gold-driven ambition, as well as the weight of uncertainty that awaited them on the voyage ahead. When the preparations were complete, the passenger list and crew roster together accounted for 83 people who would share the long journey across the sea. 58 of these were passengers, and the remainder formed the crew tasked with navigating and maintaining the ship throughout the months ahead. Each name on the manifest represented a story of endurance, of time spent in pursuit of fortune, and of the fragile hope that the journey would end safely in England, where families waited and wealth could finally be secured. Many of the passengers had spent years working in isolated mining settlements, where success depended on patience, endurance, and the unpredictable promise of gold. Life in the camps was dictated by weather, equipment, and sheer physical labour, and even the smallest successes were often offset by failures or misfortune. Yet the prospect of returning home with wealth, or even a modest savings, gave travellers a sense of purpose and a determination that would carry them through the long voyage ahead. The hope of securing what they had earned created a quiet tension aboard the ship even before it had left port. Hidden within luggage, secured in small containers, or carefully wrapped among personal belongings, some of the travellers carried gold that represented the rewards of long and difficult labour. The precious metal was not always obvious to onlookers, yet its presence created an undercurrent of unease and anticipation. The value of what was being transported added another layer of significance to the voyage. Turning the ship itself into more than a vessel of commerce, it became a floating repository of human ambition, hope, and risk. In addition to the wealth belonging to individual miners, the ship also transported commercial shipments of gold destined for markets in Britain. These consignments were carefully secured in the cargo hold and closely accounted for, intended to reach the distant ports of London without loss. The combination of private and commercial gold heightened the stakes of the voyage, rendering every decision, from navigation to provisioning, critical to the safety and success of all on board. Throughout the harbour, cranes and loading crews continued transferring cargo into the ship's holds, while provisions were stored for the long journey ahead. Barrels of food, fresh water, and equipment filled the spaces beneath the deck alongside crates of goods for trade, each item carefully stowed to maintain balance and accessibility. Sailors checked rigging and sails, ensuring the vessel was ready to face the unpredictable Southern Ocean. The atmosphere aboard the General Grant combined urgency with meticulous preparation, a balance of human effort and anticipation for what lay beyond the safety of the harbour. For many of the passengers stepping aboard, the vessel represented the final stage of a journey that had begun years earlier, when news of gold first reached distant parts of the world. Each had travelled long distances to reach Melbourne, and now the last leg of their voyage would carry them across thousands of kilometres of open water. The ship was their bridge between continents, and its timbers and sails held the potential to bring fortune home, or, as some would silently fear, to leave them stranded far from the life they had built. Most travellers expected the weeks ahead to be long but routine, following the well-established sea route that merchant ships used when sailing from Australia toward Britain. The rhythm of life at sea was known in broad strokes. Days marked by labour, navigation, and occasional storms, nights measured by watches and the watchful eyes of the crew. Yet, beneath the surface of ordinary expectation, a tension lingered, an unspoken awareness that the oceans could quickly transform from familiar highway into a treacherous expanse. Soon the ship would leave the crowded harbour behind and turn southward toward the wide and uncertain waters of the Southern Ocean, leaving Melbourne for a long journey home. The ropes were cast off, and sails unfurled as the General Grant slipped away from the crowded docks, leaving behind the noise and bustle of Melbourne Harbour. The air carried the scent of salt and timber, mingled with the faint dust of coal and cargo, while passengers watched the familiar shoreline shrink into the distance. Dock hands called out directions, and crew members moved quickly along the deck, checking lines and ensuring the ship cleared the harbour without incident. Though the port had been alive with energy only moments before, the vessel's movement signalled the first step into isolation, in which land would soon vanish entirely, and the ocean itself would dominate the horizon. For the first hours, the waters were deceptively calm, and the passengers watched the city fade while the ship began its long southern track. Gentle swells carried the vessel steadily, as seagulls circled overhead, leaving only the echo of waves against the hull to remind travellers of the growing distance between themselves and the civilization they had left behind. Conversations were subdued, punctuated by the creak of timbers and the flutter of sails above. The anticipation of months at sea, paired with the gold and belongings they carried, created an unspoken tension among those who had spent years in the Australian goldfields and were now bound for distant shores. On deck, sailors moved with a practiced efficiency, trimming sails and adjusting rigging to catch the steady wind that would guide the vessel into open waters. Every rope had its purpose, every knot its importance, and each man aboard the ship knew that a single misstep could compromise not only the vessel's speed, but the safety of all who had embarked on this journey. Officers walked the deck, giving quiet instructions, while the captain observed from the quarterdeck, scanning the horizon for changes in weather and the shape of the approaching seas. As the ship rounded the southern tip of the continent, the vast expanse of the Southern Ocean stretched ahead, a realm notorious for sudden storms and unrelenting currents. Mariners had long warned that these waters, though distant from the eyes of the wider world, held dangers that could unmake even the sturdiest of vessels. The currents ran deep and swift, carrying a chill that hinted at the polar regions beyond, and the wind had already begun to fluctuate with a capricious unpredictability that made the passage southward a test of skill, patience, and endurance. Clouds gathered on the horizon, and the gentle swell grew restless, foreshadowing the mercurial temperament that these southern waters could unleash without warning. The passengers, many of whom had never ventured so far from land, sensed the growing power of the ocean. Their excitement mingled with unease. Crew members kept a watchful eye, adjusting sails to compensate for subtle shifts in wind direction, while the vessel's rhythmic roll reminded everyone that control at sea was always provisional. Captain William H. Laughlin and his officers consulted charts and used their sextants, aware that even a small miscalculation could carry the ship perilously close to hidden reefs or rocky outcrops. Navigating this stretch of ocean required careful attention to latitude and longitude, wind patterns and current flow. The crew relied on the accumulated knowledge of long-distance sailors, measuring each movement with precision, yet even with experience on their side, the vastness of the Southern Ocean made every decision carry weighty consequences. By the second day, the wind had shifted unpredictably, and the vessel heeled sharply under the strain of the shifting sails, reminding all aboard that the ocean could turn from partner to adversary in an instant. The ship pitched and rolled, and though the crew maintained their positions with practiced composure, the passengers were jolted by the sudden motion, feeling the first hints of the ocean's power. Conversations fell quiet, replaced by the sound of water striking the hull and the constant shush of wind through rigging. It was a reminder that the journey was no longer defined by the comfort of harbour or port, but by the raw forces of the southern seas. Many passengers stood at the rail, staring at the unbroken horizon, feeling both awe at the endless blue and unease at the isolation of being so far from land. Some clutched belongings, others watched companions with apprehension, and a few simply absorbed the vastness around them in silent contemplation. The feeling was pervasive. Though the voyage began as routine, the vast and indifferent ocean carried the latent threat of storms, swells, and sudden change, and the travellers could only prepare themselves for what might come. Below deck, crews checked provisions and passengers settled into the rhythms of sea life, where meals, chores, and the quiet hours between watches became measured against the relentless motion of the waves. Cabins echoed with the subdued movements of passengers adjusting to the constant roll, while the smell of food, tar, and damp timber reminded all aboard that life at sea demanded adaptation. Even in these early days, the vast distance from land and the monotony of endless water underscored the fragility of human presence against the power of the ocean. The ship's compass needle quivered slightly under the influence of ocean currents, and the distant rolling swell hinted at conditions far more severe than those experienced near the coast. Officers adjusted the course to maintain the intended trajectory toward the Indian Ocean and eventually Britain, knowing that any misstep could be magnified in these unpredictable waters. The passengers, unaware of the meticulous calculations occurring above and below deck, were left with only the visual drama of unbroken horizon, moving seas, and a growing awareness of their vulnerability. As the General Grant pressed farther south, the open ocean seemed to stretch endlessly, concealing the dangers that would soon emerge near the shadowed islands to the south. When the ocean revealed a fatal mistake. The General Grant pressed steadily southward, each wave carrying the ship closer to the uncharted hazards that had long haunted mariners of the Southern Ocean. The rolling expanse of water stretched endlessly, a grey, restless plain that seemed indifferent to human planning or ambition. Sailors moved along the deck with cautious efficiency, scanning the horizon for changes in wind or swell, while passengers clung to rails or leaned toward the railings, sensing the increasing remoteness of the waters through which they sailed. The Southern Ocean had been generous enough in its calm hours, but even then, its subtle currents and sudden gusts hinted at a more capricious nature lurking just beyond the fog. A thick grey fog rolled across the deck, blurring the horizon and muffling the constant crash of waves against the hull, leaving both crew and passengers in uneasy silence. Visibility dropped to only a few yards, and familiar landmarks were swallowed entirely. The air smelled of salt, cold, and the faint tang of wet timber, while every creak of the ship and whisper of rope seemed amplified in the dense mist. Below deck, passengers who had hoped for a calm evening watched in tension as muffled footsteps and shouted instructions echoed from the spars above, a reminder that life at sea could shift from routine to peril with little warning. Through a narrow break in the mist, the dark shapes of cliffs appeared, jagged and immovable, revealing that the ship had drifted perilously close to the islands. The shapes were sudden and jarring, emerging as if from nowhere, their black faces outlined against the dim light of a lowering sky. Waves broke violently against hidden reefs, sending white spray skyward, a stark warning of the dangers lurking just beneath the surface. Crew and passengers alike were frozen for a moment by the sheer abruptness of the sight. An unanticipated landmass, formidable and unyielding, appearing where hours before only fog and open water had existed. Officers shouted commands as the captain's gaze swept the charts, confirming that the vessel's position was far closer to the treacherous coast than any intended course had allowed. Dead reckoning had underestimated the strength of the southern currents, and the fog had concealed the island's presence until it was almost too late. Every adjustment to the helm, every call to shift sail carried weighty consequences, for even the slightest error could carry the General Grant onto rocks hidden beneath the waves. The crew moved with urgency, yet a quiet panic lingered beneath the professional veneer, for the Southern Ocean's temperament was beyond human control. The wind gusted suddenly, carrying spray across the deck, while swells slammed into the rocks below, emphasizing the lethal potential of the approaching shoreline. The vessel pitched sharply, and loose items clattered below, startling passengers who had watched the cliffs in silent apprehension. The sound of water striking timber seemed unnaturally loud in the fog, a reminder that the boundaries between safety and disaster were narrow and ever-shifting. Even as sails were trimmed and rigging adjusted, the sea's raw power was impossible to ignore, a constant reminder that human skill could only go so far against such forces. Some travellers leaned over the rail, staring in awe at the emerging land, while others murmured anxious questions, sensing only vaguely the magnitude of the peril closing in around them. Many had never seen the Auckland Islands, let alone imagine their cliffs rising sharply from the sea. Others, aware of the island's reputation among sailors, felt a chill at the thought of the ship's proximity to reefs and hidden rocks. The passengers' wonder at the sudden appearance of land was mingled with an instinctive unease. The realization that even the most experienced sailors could miscalculate their approach weighed heavily on the group. The Auckland Islands were known to sailors as a graveyard of timbered cliffs, hidden reefs, and violent currents. the isolation magnifying every small error in navigation into near disaster. Histories of prior wrecks and near misses had circulated in maritime records, a sombre reminder that these waters tolerated no mistakes. Even the strongest ships and most seasoned crews were vulnerable to the combination of fog, wind, and treacherous coastline. Maps marked reefs and shoals, but precise locations were often uncertain, and the island's jagged cliffs provided little margin for error once the ocean's currents had drawn a vessel too close. Sails were adjusted, and rudder angles changed in rapid succession as the crew fought to steer the vessel away from immediate danger. But the limits of wind and tide constrained every manoeuvre. Officers shouted orders over the wind and the crash of waves, coordinating movements across the deck and into the rigging. Lines were tightened, sails shifted, and the helm worked to counteract the pull of currents that had carried the ship toward danger almost imperceptibly. The crew's skill slowed the approach, but it could not erase the fact that the ship had drifted far closer than any sailor would have intended. With darkness falling and the fog thickening, the crew understood that the slightest misjudgment could spell catastrophe, and the ship's fate now teetered on the edge of chance. Shadows deepened across the deck, waves reflected dimly in the scattered light, and every sound, the groan of timbers, the slap of water against hull, the shouts of men, reminded all aboard of their precarious position. Even as the General Grant continued to respond to the crew's adjustments, the knowledge that one more misstep could carry the vessel onto rocks lent a quiet terror to the hours before night fully fell. Through the rolling fog, the jagged silhouette of the islands loomed ever closer, a silent testament to an error that could not be undone. The night the ship was pushed into stone, the cliffs of the Auckland Islands rose suddenly from the dark water, and the General Grant seemed to hesitate as if sensing the peril that lay ahead. Shadows stretched across the deck, and the wind carried a sharp, briny chill that reminded all aboard of the remoteness and power of the southern seas. The ship pitched and rolled, each movement magnified by the sudden narrowing of space between vessel and cliff. Lanterns swung violently in the wind, casting fragmented light that revealed rigging swaying like the arms of a restless ghost. Officers consulted the charts by flickering lamplight, but the thickening fog and near darkness made precise navigation almost impossible, and every second deepened the tension on deck and below. Winds howled from the northwest, driving the vessel sideways while currents tugged relentlessly at the hull, leaving even the most skilled sailors struggling for mastery over the ship's movement. The Southern Ocean's notorious currents, particularly near the islands, had long been known to carry ships toward hidden reefs and cliffs, and tonight their strength was undeniable. Waves rose higher than the railings, lashing the decks with salt spray that stung faces and eyes, while timbers groaned under the constant strain. Even the captain's experienced command could not fully counteract the relentless push, and each small manoeuvre seemed swallowed by the ocean's raw power. A yawning sea cave appeared like a black mouth in the cliff face, its entrance jagged and unforgiving, offering neither refuge nor escape from the pounding ocean beyond. The hollow widened slightly beyond the jagged threshold, creating a cavern that echoed every crash and shout. The cave's interior was slick with spray and darkness, and the ship's shadows flickered like spectres across its stone walls. Wind gusted unpredictably, funneling through the narrow opening, and the vessel's sails trembled under the strain, as if the ship itself sensed that it had entered a place where human skill held little sway. Inside the cave, waves thundered against the timber, splintering boards and sending spray across the deck, while darkness pressed down and every shouted command was swallowed by the roar of water. The echo distorted sounds, making orders and calls overlap, confusing sailors and frightening passengers. Lanterns were almost useless against the shadows and spray, illuminating only fragments of ropes, masts, and terrified faces before the light vanished again into the gloom. Below deck, cargo creaked and shifted with each lurch, while the smell of wet timber, tar, and salt water became almost suffocating. Hands gripped ropes and the helm as officers barked orders, trying to angle the sails and anchor the vessel, but the ocean's force left the ship at the mercy of each crash and surge. Sailors listened for the telltale scrape of rocks beneath the keel, using sounding leads wherever possible, but the dark, turbulent water made measurements perilously unreliable. Each adjustment of the rudder or repositioning of sails was a race against chance, with the slightest miscalculation potentially catastrophic. The captain's voice, hoarse from shouting above the roar, carried authority, but even his experience could not prevent the ship from being drawn inexorably deeper into the cave. Hidden reefs and sharp rocks lurked beneath the frothing water, scraping against the hull, and each swell threatened to push the ship further into the unyielding stone walls. The hull shuddered as timbers were bruised and splintered, sending tremors through the decks that passengers felt in every bone. The sound of cracking wood echoed like distant thunder, magnified by the cave's high ceiling. Waves collided from multiple angles, and spray stung the sailors' skin, while the shadows of the cliffs moved like monsters alongside the ship, making the boundary between water and stone nearly impossible to discern. Mariners had long warned of the island's lethal cliffs and the treacherous caves at their base, where full-rigged ships could be trapped with little hope of escape. The Auckland Islands' southern coastline had claimed countless vessels over decades, and even the most experienced captains knew that a single misjudged approach could end in disaster. The cave itself, carved over centuries by relentless surf, was wide enough to swallow a ship, yet narrow enough to prevent easy manoeuvring. The crew's knowledge of past wrecks heightened every tension, while passengers, aware only vaguely of the danger, whispered and trembled, sensing that even the best-prepared expedition could falter against nature's fury. Timbers groaned, masts shuddered, and the vessel leaned perilously as the night pressed on, making clear that no skill or effort could fully stave off the impending disaster. Every swell pressed the ship closer to the cave walls. Every gust threatened the masts and rigging. The wind funneled in strange directions, and the deck tilted so sharply at times that sailors had to brace themselves to avoid being thrown into the spray. Even for those accustomed to the Southern Ocean, the cave distorted sound, sight, and balance, making it impossible to accurately judge the ship's motion or position. The line between survival and catastrophe narrowed with each passing moment. Passengers clutched rails or huddled in corners, while crew members coordinated with terse, precise shouts, their movements rhythmically dictated by the sway of the ship and the violent collisions with waves. Hearts pounded as they felt the hull shift against hidden rocks, sensing without seeing the treacherous floor beneath the water. The combination of darkness, spray, and echoing waves created a sense that the ship existed in a world separate from normal rules, a place where only the ocean's law prevailed. In the heart of the cave, with waves smashing against the timber and darkness pressing from all sides, the ship teetered on the brink of ruin, powerless against the forces that had driven it into stone. Lifeboats launched into panic and darkness. No! With the ship battered against stone and the hull quivering under every wave, the captain made the grim decision that no vessel, however sturdy, could withstand the night's fury any longer. The roar of the Southern Ocean filled every corner of the deck, drowning commands and filling hearts with icy dread. Lanterns swung violently in the wind, casting fractured light across trembling faces and soaking timbers. Passengers clung to rails or to one another, realizing that the shelter of the General Grant had been betrayed by the very waters it sought to cross. Every surge of the swell pressed the urgency of the moment upon them. To remain on the ship was to court almost certain death. Crew members scrambled across the slippery deck, securing ropes, inspecting lifeboats, and tightening lines with hands numbed by cold and salt. The davits creaked under the strain of the swaying vessels, threatening to give way under the combined weight of passengers, supplies, and waterlogged timber. Sailors coordinated with terse, precise shouts, their movements dictated by the violent rocking of the ship and the whims of the storm. The ropes mooring the lifeboats thudded against the timbers, each snap and creak a grim reminder that a single misstep could send a boat crashing against the rocks below. Men and women pressed toward the open craft, some slipping on wet planks, others frozen in shock, their eyes wide as the darkness seemed to close in around them. Families huddled together, miners who had survived months in Australia's goldfields, trembling alongside travellers unused to the ferocity of southern waters. Panic spread in uneven waves, with some passengers pushing forward blindly while others recoiled, terrified of being thrown into the blackness. Shouts mixed with the shriek of the wind and the roar of crashing waves, creating a chaos that seemed to disorient even the most seasoned sailors. The first of the rafts was lowered with a jolt, plunging into the swell as oars struck water thick with foam and spray. The craft pitched violently, forcing passengers to cling to sides and each other as waves threatened to wash them overboard. Every stroke of the oars fought against the ocean's relentless pull, while spray lashed faces and soaked clothing, turning every motion into a test of endurance. Shadows of the cliffs loomed like silent, immovable sentinels, occasionally glimpsed through lightning flashes or the flickering lantern light, their jagged outlines emphasizing the precariousness of every movement. An overloaded craft met its fate within moments. Caught by a towering wave, it capsized instantly, tossing its occupants into the icy water. Screams and cries for help were swallowed by the storm, and passengers struggled to surface, some striking debris or one another as they clawed for purchase. Limbs stiffened by cold, lungs gasping for air, many were pulled beneath the frothing waves before they could grasp hold of floating timber. The randomness of survival was stark. A hand stretching toward hope could just as easily meet the crushing weight of water and stone. Those who clung to timber or partially submerged rafts fought desperately to stay afloat, muscles numb and lips blue from the freezing spray. Every wave threatened to separate them from life-saving debris, and even the strongest swimmers had to contend with the pull of hidden currents and sudden swells. The storm masked direction, making it impossible to discern which way led to safety or which way returned toward hidden reefs. Shouts pierced the night, sometimes answered, sometimes lost entirely to the roar, creating a haunting chorus that spoke more of helplessness than hope. Meanwhile, officers and sailors continued to coordinate launches wherever possible, their voices hoarse, hands bleeding from gripping ropes, bodies trembling with exertion and cold. They were aware that every second counted, yet the unpredictable gusts and towering waves rendered their efforts partial at best. Lanterns, swinging wildly, revealed only fleeting glimpses of terrified faces, tossed equipment, and the constant motion of the ocean, leaving the sense that the General Grant and its passengers had entered a world ruled by chance rather than skill. Under the storm-dark sky, the survivors in the water and on partially loaded boats began to understand the isolation that the Auckland Islands imposed. The black cliffs were distant, immovable, and indifferent, rising like silent witnesses to the havoc below. Even for those who managed to avoid being thrown into the surf, the night stretched endlessly ahead, bitterly cold and mercilessly dark. Every heartbeat was a reminder that this was not the end of the ordeal, only the opening of a far more prolonged struggle against wind, waves, and isolation. Clinging to fragments of timber in the blackness and chaos, those still alive understood that escaping the wreck was only the first trial, and the true struggle for survival awaited on the shore. The few who reached the shore. Waves threw the few remaining survivors against the jagged rocks, and they clawed their way onto the cold, unforgiving sand, gasping as if each breath had been borrowed from the ocean itself. Salt water streamed from their hair and clothing, and limbs that had fought to stay afloat now trembled from the shock of cold and exertion. The roar of the sea persisted behind them, a reminder that the chaos of the night was not yet over, while the black cliffs of the Auckland Islands rose before them, silent and immovable, demanding attention that no survivor dared to ignore. Each step on the wet sand threatened to send them back into the surf, yet the promise of land offered the only fragile hope of safety. The island revealed a harsh and unwelcoming face, cliffs that rose like silent sentinels, black rocks slick with spray, and patches of dense scrub that offered neither comfort nor cover. Pools of water collected between boulders, reflecting the dim moonlight, and small gulls cried above in voices that seemed as hollow and detached as the waves themselves. The survivors scanned the shoreline, noting that escape from the beach alone would require climbing treacherous ridges or navigating paths hidden beneath tangled vegetation. The terrain was a puzzle of sharp rocks and uneven ground, each fragment of land testing the balance and endurance of those who had already endured a night at sea. Shivering and soaked, the survivors huddled together, assessing injuries, clutching whatever belongings had washed ashore, and quickly realizing that warmth, shelter, and water would determine who lived through the night. Some wrapped themselves in wet cloaks, using bodies pressed close to generate what little heat remained. Others carefully examined the sand and driftwood for usable materials, while a few of the more practical-minded scavenged flotsam from the surf, hoping to find fragments of life-saving equipment. Even the simplest acts, standing without slipping, moving from one rock to another, became vital decisions in the cold and darkness. Fear, and grief settled over the group as the faces of lost companions flashed in memory, each one a reminder that the ocean had claimed many, despite desperate struggles. Some wept silently, while others spoke in hushed tones about what they had seen. Friends pulled beneath the waves, cries lost to the storm and rafts that had disappeared into the night. The shock of survival was accompanied by the haunting awareness that reaching land did not erase the trauma of the ordeal. The survivors' minds wrestled with disbelief, wondering how chance or endurance had singled them out, leaving them among the very few to witness the island's bleak shores. Every step across the uneven terrain was treacherous. Rocks sharp beneath bare or waterlogged feet, and sudden gusts of wind threatened to unbalance even the most cautious among them. Spray from the waves continued to reach the beach intermittently, leaving puddles and slick surfaces that made movement hazardous. Low-hanging branches and dense scrub scraped faces and clothing, while hidden gaps between boulders promised further injury for anyone not watching closely. The island was deceptively silent, yet every sound, the crash of a wave, the whistle of wind through the cliffs, was a reminder that danger remained immediate and constant. Amid the turmoil, a few of the more experienced travellers and sailors began to coordinate, gathering debris, scouting for fresh water, and attempting to signal some distant hope of rescue, however remote it might be. Timber from the wreck was repurposed into makeshift shelters, and small groups were formed to explore nearby ridges and gullies, searching for any sign of a safe route inland. Instructions were whispered, orders given, and tasks assigned, as even the smallest measure of organisation became essential to prevent panic from consuming the fragile unity of the survivors. Every decision, where to walk, whom to help, what to salvage, was weighted with life or death, and the night pressed heavily upon each choice. As night fell and the wind howled across the blackened cliffs, the survivors understood that the island's silence was deceptive, hiding dangers that would test not only their bodies but their resolve in the days to come. The cold seeped through clothes and bones, and exhaustion gnawed at minds already burdened by grief and terror. The cliffs and rocks, so still in the darkness, promised hidden threats, steep drops, unstable surfaces, and shadows where one could easily stumble or fall. Even the ocean, now calmer along the shore, continued to roar in the distance, a relentless reminder that the boundary between safety and catastrophe was razor thin. The ocean behind them had taken so much, but the island ahead promised trials equally merciless, and those who had reached its shore could not yet claim even the smallest measure of safety. The match that decided their fate. The survivors huddled close together on the darkened sand, shivering as the bitter wind cut through their sodden clothing, each aware that warmth would determine who lived through the night. Exhaustion weighed heavily on everybody, and the salt and cold from the ocean clung to skin and hair, leaving them numb and trembling. The black cliffs rose above the beach like silent watchers, while the relentless roar of the sea reminded them that the ocean had already claimed so many lives. For the first time since reaching shore, the survivors understood that without fire, the night itself could become a grave. Driftwood and broken branches soaked from the relentless waves were scavenged from the shoreline with trembling hands, their weight and dampness emphasizing the enormity of the task ahead. Each fragment was heavy and clung with salt water, making the simplest gestures of gathering laborious. Small clusters of survivors formed teams, moving carefully over jagged rocks and tangled scrub to retrieve anything that might feed a flame. Even the sand underfoot seemed to resist movement, slick with surf and debris, as if the island itself were testing their resolve before allowing them to survive. Only a single box of matches remained among the survivors, and its precious contents felt impossibly fragile in hands stiffened by cold and exhaustion. The thought of failure pressed heavily on every mind. One misstrike, one wasted spark, and the cold could claim lives in minutes. The matches had survived the night at sea, but even their survival seemed almost miraculous, as though fate had chosen this small group to continue, if only for a fleeting chance. Every eye lingered on the fragile sticks, counting each as if it were a heartbeat, a measure of hope in an unforgiving place. Fingers fumbling against wet surfaces, a spark was struck, sputtering and faltering before the tinder could catch, the darkness amplifying every sound of wind and breaking surf around them. A momentary hiss of smoke rose, then vanished, leaving only the roar of the waves and the cries of gulls that circled above the cliffs. The survivors froze, hearts pounding in rhythm with the ocean, aware that even a single failure could erode morale and plunge them into panic. Each attempt was painstaking, deliberate, and terrifying, for in the damp cold, human endurance had limits that the island was ready to exploit. At last, the tinder caught, small flames dancing hungrily among the damp twigs, and the warmth spread just enough to soothe the shivering bodies pressed together in relief. The fire flickered and spat sparks, but it endured, casting long shadows over wet rocks and faces etched with fatigue, fear, and determination. Some leaned closer to feel the heat seep into frozen limbs, while others silently surveyed the shoreline, still wary of hidden dangers in the darkness. The island remained indifferent, yet for this brief fleeting moment, the survivors felt the fragile comfort of being alive. The survivors worked quickly to shelter the fledgling fire from gusts, stacking branches and shielding it with rocks, knowing that a single gust could snuff out the fragile line between life and death. Every motion was careful. A misplaced log or sudden wind could undo what had been so desperately achieved. They whispered instructions, nudged each other into position, and monitored the flame with an intensity that blurred fatigue. Even as they gained warmth, their senses remained alert to the island's hazards: sharp rocks, hidden gullies, and the constant reminder of their isolation. Even as the fire crackled and gave hope, the shadowed cliffs and dense vegetation beyond the beach hinted that the night was only the first of many trials the island would demand. The warmth could not protect them from hunger, nor could it shield them from the treacherous terrain they would soon have to navigate. Every flicker of the flame seemed to illuminate not safety, but the vast and indifferent wilderness that lay ahead, waiting to test courage, endurance, and ingenuity in ways the survivors could only imagine. The fire's glow offered a reprieve, but the island's dark and unyielding wilderness waited silently, promising challenges that would test every ounce of courage and endurance from those who had survived the ocean. Surviving on one of the loneliest islands on Earth. Dawn cast a pale light over the shore, revealing a landscape as harsh as the sea that had delivered them, where the warmth of the fire offered only a fleeting reprieve. The survivors emerged from the scant shelter they had constructed around the glow of the last flames, faces pale, fingers stiff with cold, and clothing sodden from salt water and wind. The cliffs and jagged rocks that rose sharply behind them reminded them that this island had no mercy for the unprepared, and that every decision in the coming days could mean life or death. The brief comfort of the previous night's fire had been a fragile gift, one that could not replace the long struggle ahead in an environment entirely hostile to human survival. Hands stiff from cold, the survivors combed the rocky beaches and tangled scrub, seeking shellfish, seabird nests, or the tracks of seals that could offer nourishment. Each expedition required careful negotiation with sharp stones, slippery kelp, and hidden gullies that threatened sprained ankles or worse. The seabirds, wary of humans, were difficult to catch, and many attempts ended in frustration, leaving small groups to stare at the endless grey waves and imagine the bounty that seemed always just beyond reach. Even collecting shellfish demanded patience, as waves relentlessly washed away any gathered food, and the survivors learned quickly that each morsel was precious. Wind tore across the cliffs and sand as they stacked driftwood and wedged rocks to create rudimentary shelters, each construction a fragile barrier against the island's relentless fury. Lean-tos angled against gusts, walls reinforced with boulders, and even the careful placement of smaller stones to protect fire pits became acts of meticulous labour. Every structure bore the scars of improvisation, and even the most stable arrangement could be toppled by a sudden squall. They discovered that their shelters could not simply shield them from wind, they also provided a psychological anchor, a small dominion of human order in a place ruled by the raw, indifferent elements. A weighty silence settled over the group, broken only by the distant roar of surf and the cries of gulls, reminding them that isolation itself could be as punishing as hunger or cold. Each survivor carried memories of lost friends, the sounds of the waves merging with grief and fatigue into a constant, oppressive reminder of the fragility of life. Conversations were sparse, limited to the exchange of instructions or warnings, while eyes scanned the cliffs and shorelines for signs of danger or potential sustenance. The survivors quickly understood that endurance would not come from hope alone. It required attention, resourcefulness, and a cautious awareness of every sound and shadow in the empty landscape. Dark clouds rolled in with sudden force, unleashing icy rain and gusts that threatened every shelter and tested the survivors' endurance in a place that allowed no weakness. The fire, fragile even when carefully tended, spat sparks and smoke into the wind, demanding constant vigilance. Nights were nearly unbearable, and each survivor had to rely on body heat and proximity to the fire to stave off hypothermia. The cliffs funneled wind like a natural gale tunnel, and the roar of breaking waves felt as though the ocean itself sought to reclaim the small, struggling band of humans who had dared to set foot on this lonely island. With each passing day, they began to recognize patterns in the tides, locate fresh water, and gather food reliably, small victories that offered glimpses of control in an otherwise merciless environment. They learned which coves provided relative shelter from wind, which rocks were warmest to lie against, and which vegetation could offer a minor supplement to their limited diet. Fires became more stable, and the survivors experimented with different configurations of driftwood and rocks to protect them from sudden gusts. Each triumph was fragile, yet it strengthened their resolve, revealing that even in a landscape of unyielding danger, careful observation and effort could tip the balance in favour of survival. As the survivors adjusted to the island's demands, a quiet understanding settled among them that survival alone would not be enough, and that escaping or enduring the unknown would require every resource they could muster. Cooperation became essential. The distribution of tasks, the sharing of food, and the maintenance of fire and shelter were exercises in both strategy and trust. While physical hardships were constant, the psychological challenge was equally pressing, requiring vigilance, patience, and an unwavering sense of purpose to prevent despair from overtaking determination. They began to see themselves as not merely enduring, but learning to exist in harmony with a place that had no interest in comforting its inhabitants. The Auckland Islands' raw and unyielding wilderness remained a constant threat, and beyond the tenuous safety of their shelters, new trials awaited that would test every skill, every ounce of courage, and every hope still alive within them. The cliffs, coves, and jagged beaches held both sustenance and danger. Every meal gathered, every shelter constructed, every breath of warm air near the fire represented a delicate negotiation with the island itself. The survivors had learned to adapt, to endure, and to preserve life, but the knowledge that the ocean had already claimed so many warned them that the struggle for existence was far from over. Though they had learned to endure the island's fury, the survivors could not escape the growing realization that their fate now depended on signals, luck, and a hope that help might somehow reach them across the endless sea. The escape that disappeared into the sea. The survivors who remained on the island understood that staying could mean death, and a handful resolved to risk the treacherous waters in a desperate bid for freedom. They had endured weeks of relentless wind, rain, and scarce food, and though they had adapted to the island's harshness, the knowledge that help might never arrive pushed them toward a choice that was as daring as it was perilous. Each face reflected a mixture of fear, determination, and a fragile hope that the open ocean might somehow lead them to safety, though the memory of those already lost lingered like a shadow over the decision. Salvaging what little could be carried from the wreck, they loaded a small, fragile boat with sparse provisions, each item weighed against the uncertainty of the voyage ahead. They collected a few barrels of water, a handful of preserved rations, and any tools that might assist in navigation or survival, leaving behind anything deemed non-essential. Every movement was cautious, for the boat was narrow and barely seaworthy, and even a single misstep could tip it into the waves. Driftwood scraped the hull as they pushed the vessel into the surf, and the smell of wet kelp and salt clung to their clothes, a constant reminder of the ocean's reach. The vessel groaned under the strain as it was pushed into the cold surf, waves lapping at its sides, and the island fading behind them with every stroke of the oars. The water, dark and restless, offered no comfort, and each splash against the hull reminded them of the ocean's overwhelming scale. Gulls wheeled overhead, their sharp cries carried on the wind, while the distant roar of waves against submerged rocks seemed to echo like a warning. The survivors rowed in tense unison, muscles burning and breaths short, as their minds oscillated between focus on immediate survival and the haunting awareness of the distance they had yet to cover. Unseen currents tugged at the boat in unpredictable directions, forcing the survivors to adjust constantly, each movement demanding both strength and careful calculation. They had studied charts hastily salvaged from the wreck and attempted to gauge the nearest safe shore, but the Southern Ocean offered no guarantees, and every wave threatened to undo hours of careful effort. The cold seeped into their bones, the wind cut like a knife, and the vast expanse of grey water became a living adversary that required constant attention and effort, with no pause for rest or error. Occasionally, dark shapes bobbed in the water, driftwood, seaweed, or perhaps the shadow of unseen creatures, each one feeding both caution and unease. Mist and spray enveloped the horizon, and the cliffs they had known only hours before dissolved into grey obscurity, leaving them alone with the vast, indifferent ocean. The land became a memory, fleeting and fragile, as the survivors' thoughts turned to the immense distance to New Zealand, the nearest known point of civilization. Waves clashed with each other, forming unpredictable patterns that threatened to roll the boat, and the survivors clutched the oars tightly, aware that even a slight error could prove fatal. Their eyes scanned the horizon for any sign of hope. A ship, a distant light, anything. But all that met them was the unbroken expanse of water and sky. Gusts of wind and sudden swells tested their courage, and exhaustion quickly became as dangerous as the sea itself, pressing upon each survivor with a quiet relentlessness. Blisters formed on their hands, muscles burned, and the cold threatened to numb both body and mind. Even brief moments of calm offered little respite, for the ocean could shift in an instant, turning placid waters into a perilous maelstrom. Each glance toward the horizon was haunted by uncertainty. No other ship appeared, no landmark broke the grey, and the sense of being swallowed by the sea grew with every hour. They whispered quietly to one another, not with hope, but to fight the encroaching terror that silence and solitude imposed. No voice could be heard beyond the wind, no signal returned, and the small boat vanished into the expanse as if the ocean had claimed it without a trace. From the island, any observers could only watch the fragile craft diminish into the haze, waves erasing its passage almost as soon as it was made. Questions lingered in the minds of those left behind, whether the escapees had perished in the surf, been carried off course, or somehow found land no one could say, and the silence of the sea offered no answers. Every day afterward, the remaining survivors would scan the horizon, each ripple and shadow raising both hope and dread. Yet the ocean revealed nothing. The vast, unyielding waters kept their secrets, and the fate of those who ventured forth would remain a haunting mystery, leaving only the island and its remaining survivors to bear witness. Months of waiting with no sign of rescue. With the small boat gone, the remaining survivors faced the island's bleak expanse, each glance toward the horizon carrying a quiet dread of what lay ahead. The initial relief of being ashore had long since faded, replaced by the realization that the island's isolation was absolute. Waves battered the cliffs, and persistent wind scoured the shoreline, carrying a chill that settled deep into bones. The survivors moved slowly through the rocky terrain, surveying what little shelter remained from the wreck and salvaging anything that might prolong their endurance. Every sound, from a distant gull's call to the surf striking unseen reefs, seemed amplified in the hollow hours of anticipation, and the mist that rolled in from the ocean blurred the boundary between land and sea, lending the cliffs a ghostly, unyielding presence. Rationing became an unspoken ritual, each morsel of food and drop of water carefully measured against the long days stretching before them. They boiled shells collected from tidal pools, stretched dried meat to last longer than nature intended, and counted every mouthful as if it held the weight of the world. The scarcity of supplies was not merely a logistical problem. It imposed a psychological toll, sharpening anxiety and magnifying minor conflicts into tense silences. Even the simplest tasks, carrying water from a pool, reinforcing a shelter, demanded effort and attention, each movement a reminder of their precarious situation. Driftwood was gathered with deliberate care, not only for warmth but for the promise of a fire that might provide comfort against the endless damp. Nightfall brought restless hours, during which the wind and the crashing surf became a chorus of uncertainty and whispered fear. Sleep came in fits, broken by dreams of the ocean claiming those who had ventured into it, or by the haunting echo of waves battering invisible rocks. Shadows moved strangely in the dim light, and every sudden gust or distant sound became a question. Was it relief, a passing ship, or a new danger waiting unseen? Occasionally, the call of a petrel or the rhythmic pounding of distant surf created an eerie cadence, as if the island itself were marking the passage of time, indifferent to human suffering. The survivors counted the hours and watched the horizon in endless cycles, haunted by the knowledge that no aid might arrive. The chill of constant damp seeped into bodies weakened by hunger and exposure, leaving limbs stiff and spirits fraying at the edges. Illness crept silently through the group, from fevers brought on by exposure to minor infections that turned perilous without proper care. Even those who had been strong during the initial struggle found themselves subdued, their energy measured and their movements deliberate to conserve strength. Each cough or shiver reminded them that the island offered no comfort, and that endurance alone could not guarantee survival. They learned to recognize early signs of weakness in one another, knowing that a missed symptom could mean the difference between life and death. Occasionally, the glimmer of a distant sail or the echo of a gull's cry stirred fleeting hope, only to vanish against the unbroken grey of sky and sea. Every sighting was scrutinized, every sound interpreted with desperate attention, yet the ocean remained indifferent, erasing tracks and swallowing movement. On rare mornings, fog lifted just enough to reveal stretches of rock and waves breaking over hidden reefs, momentarily orienting the survivors before the mist returned. Moments that might have inspired relief were quickly tempered by reality. The horizon held only waves and mist, as if mocking the survivors' longing for connection. Their hopes rose and fell with the tides, fragile and impossible to secure against the relentless passage of days. Small adaptations became lifelines. Shells were boiled for sustenance, shelters reinforced against relentless gusts, and every scrap of driftwood was repurposed. They learned to read the wind, to anticipate the surge of tides, and to make the island's meagre resources stretch further. Even the simplest innovations, a windbreak made from wreckage, a catchment for rainwater, or a shallow trench to divert water from pooling inside a shelter, were infused with urgency, as the line between success and failure narrowed with each passing week. Survival had become a series of small victories, each one preserving life but never promising it. Weeks merged into months, the island's isolation pressing steadily upon the survivors, each sunrise and sunset marking progress in endurance, but not in deliverance. They measured time in routines, in the ebb and flow of tides, and in the changes of weather that could either aid or challenge them. Fatigue and anxiety layered upon each other, creating a constant tension that neither conversation nor labour could dispel. In quiet moments, they stared toward the endless grey horizon, imagining sails that never appeared and rehearsing the possibilities of rescue that the sea refused to deliver. Even the cliffs themselves seemed alien now, their jagged shapes looming in every fog and shadow, a silent reminder that the island claimed all who lingered too long. Hope and dread intertwined in every glance toward the horizon, leaving the survivors suspended between the promise of rescue and the unforgiving certainty of the island's solitude, their lives measured not in days but in the fragile rhythm of endurance. The day a ship finally appeared. After nearly a year and a half of relentless isolation, a flicker of motion on the horizon made the survivors freeze, uncertain if their eyes betrayed hope or deception. For 18 months, every glint of light or distant shape had been met with cautious skepticism, each false alarm tightening the weight of despair pressing down upon them. Yet this time, the shadow moved with deliberate purpose, cutting across the grey expanse of the Southern Ocean, and a collective breath seemed to hold itself in the cold, salt-laden air. Even from a distance, there was an unmistakable shape, a vessel, a solid line against the horizon, defying the island's long-standing silence. The survivors' minds wrestled with disbelief, unwilling to trust that fortune had finally tilted in their favour. Hands that had grown calloused from labour and weather now trembled as they waved scraps of cloth, coaxing attention from a distance that seemed both impossibly near and cruelly far. They ran across the jagged shoreline, shouting into the wind that scoured the cliffs, the sounds swallowed almost instantly by surf and gale. Improvised flags, torn from shirts or blankets, caught the faint light as the survivors waved them frantically, the motions desperate yet methodical, guided by the awareness that every gesture might mean life or continued isolation. Their voices rose above the roar of the ocean, brittle but determined, carrying hope as far as the air would allow, each echo trembling with the fragility of long-denied expectation. Through the veil of mist, the ship's silhouette slowly took shape, a black shadow against the pale expanse of sea and sky, as gulls wheeled in anxious patterns above the shoreline. Its masts were faint lines, yet unmistakably human in design, rising from the hull like spires signalling possibility. The vessel's approach was tentative, the captain cautious of the treacherous reefs and hidden shoals that had claimed so many before. From the survivors' vantage, each movement of the ship became a pulse, a heartbeat that measured the distance between the terror of solitude and the first promise of salvation. Every pair of eyes strained for confirmation, scanning the churning waters and jagged cliffs as the survivors whispered, half afraid that imagination had conjured the vessel from long-suppressed longing. A few faltered in their steps, convinced that the mirage of hope was yet another trick of the Southern Ocean, where fog and wind could birth illusions as easily as they could drown the unwary. But the vessel held steady, and slowly, almost painfully, recognition dawned. This was no spectre. The shape, the motion, the deliberate navigation toward the island, all spoke of a ship very real, carrying people who might answer the months of unanswered prayers. The first shouts carried across the surf and distant figures appeared on the deck of the ship, signalling in return, the fragile lines of communication bridging nearly 2 years of solitude. Smoke from a hastily built signal fire curled upward, catching the eye of the ship's crew, who adjusted sails and leaned over railings to read the frantic messages. It was a dance of caution and recognition, a careful negotiation between the island's hazards and the need to reach the stranded souls. For the survivors, every returned gesture confirmed what months of isolation had made almost unimaginable. Someone had seen them, and they were coming. Slowly the ship edged closer, navigating the treacherous currents and rocky coastline, while survivors clutched each other and counted every second as if time itself had grown uncertain. Waves thundered against hidden reefs, yet the vessel pressed forward, guided by experience, charts, and perhaps a cautious sense of destiny. On shore, the survivors' hearts raced with every shift of the sails, every splash of oars in the shallows, the labour of reaching land mirrored by the labour of faith, trusting that this moment of rescue would not dissolve into another disappointment. As the vessel's hull drew nearer, cutting a dark line across the endless grey of the Southern Ocean, the survivors could only wonder what awaited them beyond the island that had kept them prisoner for so long. The gold that still lies beneath the sea. Whispers of vanished gold spread quickly through the ports of Australia and New Zealand, carrying tales of the General Grant's ill-fated voyage far beyond the Auckland Islands. Merchants, sailors, and fortune-seekers alike spoke in hushed tones of the ship that had sailed with a hold laden with sovereigns and gold bars, only to vanish into the cold Southern Ocean. The story was both a warning and an invitation, as the treacherous waters around the islands were infamous for wrecking vessels long before the General Grant's arrival. Every recounting of the tragedy seemed to carry a dual note of fascination and fear, a mixture of allure and the deadly risk that the sea had claimed once more. The hold, brimming with gold meticulously recorded in the ship's manifest, now lay buried beneath relentless waves, hidden among jagged rocks and shifting sands where currents never slept. Modern explorers and historians alike have estimated that hundreds of thousands of pounds in 19th century currency were lost in that single sinking, a fortune that would have transformed the lives of those aboard. Yet the ocean, indifferent and powerful, consumed both vessel and treasure, leaving only fragments of hope for those who would attempt to claim it. Even a small glimpse of the ship's timbers, exposed during storms, was enough to ignite speculation and rekindle old legends. Mariners equipped with the rudimentary diving tools of the era ventured repeatedly to the wreck, attempting to locate the gold despite knowing the dangers. Early salvage operations were hampered by harsh currents, submerged rocks, and sudden squalls that could overturn boats in moments. Diaries and journal entries from those expeditions reveal the relentless anxiety faced by each crew, who measured every decision against the unforgiving ocean. Many returned empty-handed, exhausted, or worse, never returned at all, swallowed by the same waters that had claimed the General Grant. Stories of glimmering coins caught in the shallows, or the occasional bar glimpsed through the waves, fueled obsession among adventurers, drawing them repeatedly into perilous waters. Local legends and newspaper reports spoke of treasure hunters willing to risk everything for the faintest chance of recovery, lured by the promise of sudden wealth, yet constantly reminded by the unforgiving elements that fortune came with deadly cost. Tales circulated of boats crushed by hidden reefs, of divers succumbing to exhaustion, and of storms that seemed almost sentient in their timing. The gold became more than currency. It was a lure, a phantom that demanded both courage and hubris. Accounts survive of particularly audacious attempts. One party rigged a small diving bell and descended in near total darkness, only to be swept away by a hidden current, leaving behind nothing but frayed ropes and an echo of their ambition. Another expedition, equipped with early compressed air diving suits, found only scattered timber and bent iron as evidence of the ship's demise, reinforcing the impossibility of claiming its treasure. These anecdotes circulated widely, cementing the notion that the General Grant's gold was both tantalizingly close and insurmountably distant, a prize always just out of reach. Historical records and newspaper accounts document a series of daring expeditions over the decades, each chronicling the same pattern of determination, danger, and despair. By the early 20th century, maritime historians noted that hundreds of attempts had been made, yet none had successfully retrieved the treasure, cementing the General Grant's gold as a legend more than a prize. Reports describe elaborate plans, specialized equipment, and even early diving suits, all of which were ultimately insufficient against the natural defenses of the Southern Ocean. Each failure only deepened the allure, the impossibility of success heightening the mystery that surrounded the sunken vessel. The precise location of the General Grant's treasure remains hidden, lost to shifting tides, submerged reefs, and the inexorable passage of time. Modern attempts using sonar, underwater cameras, and remote-operated vehicles have mapped portions of the ocean floor, yet no definitive discovery has been made. Maritime scholars and treasure enthusiasts continue to speculate about the ship's final resting place, combing historical charts, accounts of survivors, and patterns of ocean currents in hopes of locating the elusive hoard. The gold has become both a historical artifact and an enduring challenge, a measure of humanity's fascination with what the sea can conceal. Beneath the unforgiving waters, guarded by relentless currents, jagged reefs, and the weight of decades of mystery, the General Grant's gold lies in silence, daring all who seek it to risk everything. How a forgotten wreck changed maritime survival. Long after the last survivors were carried from the shore, the wreck of the General Grant lingered in the minds of maritime authorities, a haunting testament to what isolation could claim. Reports of the ship's final hours and the peril faced by those left stranded highlighted an uncomfortable truth. No matter how strong a vessel or crew, the Southern Ocean could render even the most prepared travellers powerless. The tragedy became a case study in the unforgiving nature of remote islands, demonstrating that human endurance alone was often insufficient in the face of cold, hunger, and solitude. Authorities began to view remote islands not merely as obstacles to navigation, but as potential havens where carefully concealed stores of food and tools could offer a chance at survival. Inspired by the fate of the General Grant's crew, maritime boards in Britain and New Zealand advocated for the placement of castaway depots on the subantarctic islands scattered across the southern seas. The goal was simple yet profound: provide a lifeline to those who, like the survivors of the General Grant, might find themselves marooned with little hope of immediate rescue. Each depot was positioned with precision, often tucked into hidden coves or behind cliffs that shielded them from storms, designed to endure the harsh southern elements and provide life when the sea turned against travellers. Supplies included canned goods, salted meat, blankets, and basic tools such as axes and knives, sometimes accompanied by instructions written on durable materials. These depots were constructed to be discoverable by those who knew the general location, but elusive enough to survive storms, tides, and the passage of time, a delicate balance between concealment and accessibility. Decades of reports chronicled instances where stranded sailors stumbled upon these caches, their discovery transforming despair into a renewed determination to survive against impossible odds. In many cases, individuals who might have perished from exposure or starvation were able to endure until rescue arrived, the depots providing both sustenance and a psychological lifeline. Each story underscored the critical role of foresight, illustrating how careful planning in seemingly desolate regions could preserve life where none seemed possible. The mere knowledge that provisions might exist somewhere on the island became a quiet lifeline, a psychological anchor that sustained those stranded long after hope seemed to have vanished. Sailors would often ration themselves with meticulous care, conserving energy while waiting for relief, fortified by the thought that even the most remote islands were no longer entirely without mercy. The depots offered more than food. They offered a measure of human connection, a tangible acknowledgement that someone had prepared for their survival. Maintaining these lifelines was no simple task. Supplies deteriorated under relentless weather. Storms sometimes swept away entire stores, and constant inspection was required to ensure their usefulness to future castaways. Teams tasked with replenishment risked the same perils as any sailor, navigating turbulent waters and unpredictable winds to reach these isolated outposts. Their work, largely unheralded, quietly established a network of survival that would extend the reach of hope across the subantarctic seas. Even with careful planning, the ocean remained indifferent, a reminder that human foresight could only mitigate risk, never fully conquer the unpredictable forces that had claimed so many lives before. Each depot served as both protection and a testament to necessity, a fragile line between life and the abyss. Mariners learned that while skill, courage, and endurance were vital, survival also depended on preparation that transcended individual effort, extending the possibility of life beyond immediate circumstance. The legacy of those hidden stores would ripple across decades, quietly shaping the survival of sailors who would one day confront the same treacherous waters that had swallowed the General Grant.